The shovel hit frozen earth with a dull thud that echoed across Pine Ridge Valley like a death knell. Jake Mitchell paused, his weathered hands trembling around the wooden handle, sweat mixing with tears he refused to acknowledge. The hole was already 3 feet deep, carved into the rocky Montana soil behind his grandfather's barn, where the morning sun couldn't quite reach. He wasn't burying livestock this time. This grave was meant for something far more precious: his dreams, his legacy, his reason for breathing. The foreclosure notice crumpled in his back pocket felt heavier than the shovel in his hands. 30 days. That's all Victor Hartwell had given him before the bulldozers would roll across Mitchell Ranch, erasing 4 generations of blood, sweat, and memories. Jake had spent the last 3 sleepless nights calculating impossible mathematics. How to conjure $150,000 from a bank account that hadn't seen 4 digits in 2 years. How to make dying cattle worth more than their weight in debt. How to turn back time to before his father's cancer treatments had bled the ranch dry. The November wind whipped across the valley, carrying the scent of coming snow and the distant howl of wolves that had grown bold in recent months. Jake's cattle, what remained of them, huddled near the barn, their ribs showing through patchy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Winter coats. He'd sold everything that wasn't nailed down: his father's vintage Ford, his mother's jewelry, even the antique weather vane that had crowned the barn since 1943. None of it had been enough to satisfy Hartwell's appetite for land and power. Jake resumed digging, each strike of the shovel a punctuation mark in his internal eulogy for the only life he'd ever known. The ranch stretched out before him in all directions, 500 acres of rugged beauty that had shaped him from a boy into a man who knew every stone, every creek bend, every hidden canyon where cattle sheltered from summer storms. His grandfather had built this place with nothing but determination and calloused hands. His father had expanded it during the good years when beef prices soared and rain fell in perfect measure. Jake was destined to be the Mitchell who lost it all. The sound of approaching engines cut through the morning stillness like a chainsaw through silk. Jake's head snapped up, his heart hammering against his ribs as 3 black SUVs crested the hill leading to his property. They moved with predatory purpose, kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the air like smoke signals announcing the end of everything. Hartwell hadn't waited for the 30 days to expire. He was coming to collect early, probably with eviction papers and armed security to ensure Jake's compliance. Jake dropped the shovel and wiped his palms on his jeans, knowing that whatever came next would require steady hands and a clear head. Vehicles stopped in a semicircle near his front porch, their tinted windows reflecting the pale autumn sky like dead eyes. Car doors slammed with military precision, and 6 men emerged wearing expensive suits that looked wildly out of place against the backdrop of weathered fence posts and rusted machinery. Victor Hartwell stepped from the lead vehicle like a general, surveying conquered territory. He was a man who wore power like cologne, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. His silver hair was slicked back with the kind of precision that spoke of daily barbershop visits, and his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who viewed human suffering as a necessary component of profitable business. At 62, Hartwell had spent 4 decades acquiring distressed properties across Montana, transforming family ranches into luxury developments and ski resorts that catered to wealthy tourists who wanted to play cowboy for a weekend. "Mitchell," Hartwell called out, his voice carrying the false warmth of a politician addressing constituents he planned to betray. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? Perfect weather for making difficult decisions." Jake walked toward the group, his boots crunching against frost-hardened grass. He kept his expression neutral, though every instinct screamed at him to reach for the rifle mounted in his truck's rear window. Violence wouldn't solve his problems, but it might provide a moment's satisfaction before the inevitable destruction of everything he held dear. "You're early, Hartwell," Jake replied, stopping 20 feet from the assembled men. "Last I checked, 30 days meant 30 days, not 3. Hartwell's smile was the kind sharks might wear if they possessed the capacity for human expression. "Oh, but circumstances have changed, my friend. You see, I've had some very interesting conversations with your neighbors. The Hendersons to the east, the Parkers to the south. They've decided to be practical about their financial situations. They're selling to me voluntarily, which means your little island of stubbornness is now completely surrounded by my territory." The words hit Jake like physical blows. Tom Henderson had been his father's best friend, a man who'd sworn over beers and barbecue that he'd never sell his family's legacy to corporate vultures. Sarah Parker had been Jake's high school sweetheart before life pulled them in different directions, but she'd always maintained that her ranch was sacred ground where her children would learn the values that only came from working the land with their own hands. "I don't believe you," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. He'd noticed fewer lights in the Henderson house recently, fewer cattle in the Parker pastures. Signs he'd chosen to ignore because acknowledging them would mean accepting that. He was truly alone in his fight against progress that looked suspiciously like destruction. Hartwell reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder thick with legal documents. "Signed, sealed, and notarized yesterday afternoon. Both families were quite relieved to escape their financial burdens with their dignity intact. I'm offering you this same opportunity, Jake. Same generous terms. Same chance to walk away with enough money to start fresh somewhere else." Jake's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The offer was a trap disguised as mercy, a way for Hartwell to claim moral high ground while destroying everything Jake's family had built. The money would be enough to pay off the debts and maybe rent a small apartment in Helena, but it would never be enough to rebuild a life that had been rooted in this specific piece of earth for nearly a century. "And if I refuse?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then tomorrow morning, my legal team files for immediate foreclosure based on your default status. The sheriff's department will arrive with eviction notices, and you'll have exactly 4 hours to remove your personal possessions before my demolition crew begins preparing the site for development." Hartwell's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than the annihilation of a man's entire world. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Jake could feel his future collapsing in real time, each second bringing him closer to a moment when he would have to choose between surrender and a fight he couldn't possibly win. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ranch around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting to learn whether it would survive another day or become another casualty in the war between tradition and profit. "I need time to think," Jake said finally, hating the weakness he heard in his own voice. "Of course," Hartwell replied, his smile never wavering. "You have until sunset today. That should be plenty of time to come to terms with reality." He turned back toward his vehicle, then paused as if struck by an afterthought. "Oh, and Jake, if you're considering anything dramatic, I should mention that my security team will be monitoring the property until our business is concluded. For everyone's safety, you understand." The caravan of black SUVs disappeared over the hill as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving Jake alone with the weight of an impossible decision and the echo of his grandfather's voice telling him that a man's word was his bond and his land was his soul. The hole he'd been digging yawned behind him like an open mouth, waiting to swallow whatever remained of his hope. Jake walked back to the grave he'd started, picked up the shovel, and began digging with renewed fury. Each strike against the frozen earth was a blow against his helplessness, a physical manifestation of the rage that threatened to consume him from the inside. He dug until his hands bled and his back screamed in protest, until the hole was deep. Enough to bury not just his dreams, but himself along with them. The sun reached its zenith and began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold that reminded Jake of better times when the future had seemed as limitless as the Montana horizon. He climbed out of the hole and sat on its edge, his legs dangling into the darkness he'd carved from the earth. This was where his story would end, a broken man in a hole of his own making, defeated by forces beyond his control or understanding. As the shadows lengthened and the first stars appeared in the deepening sky, Jake pulled the foreclosure notice from his pocket and smoothed it against his knee. The legal language was dense and impersonal, reducing 4 generations of love and labor to a series of missed payments and unfulfilled obligations. He struck a match and held it to the corner of the document, watching the flames consume the words that had already consumed his life. The burning paper fluttered into the grave like a dying bird, its ashes settling into the dirt that would soon cover everything he'd ever cared about. Jake closed his eyes and let the magnitude of his loss wash over him, a tide of grief so profound it felt like drowning in slow motion. This was how his grandfather's legacy would end, not with the dignity of passing from father to son, but with the violence of lawyers and bulldozers and men who measured worth in dollars rather than dreams. A branch snapped in the darkness beyond the barn, sharp as a gunshot in the still air. Jake's eyes flew open, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife on his belt. Hartwell's security team was probably watching him from the tree line, making sure he didn't do anything to damage their boss's future investment. The thought of being observed in his moment of complete defeat added insult to the injury that was already bleeding him dry. Another sound drifted through the night, the soft whisper of footsteps moving through dry grass, too light to belong to grown men in tactical boots. Jake stood slowly, every muscle in his body protesting after hours of digging and despair. The footsteps were coming closer, accompanied by hushed voices that carried the unmistakable cadence of children trying not to be heard. "Hello," Jake called out, his voice hoarse from hours of silent suffering. "Who's out there?" The footsteps stopped abruptly, followed by a silence so complete it seemed to muffle even the distant howl of coyotes in the hills. Jake took a step toward the sound, then another, drawn by curiosity that temporarily overshadowed his self-pity. Children had no business wandering around his property at night, especially not with Hartwell's men lurking somewhere in the darkness like wolves waiting for their chance to strike. "I know you're there," Jake said, gentling his voice. "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you." A small figure emerged from behind the barn, followed by another, then another, until 7 children stood in the pale moonlight like apparitions summoned from his darkest fears. They were thin to the point of gauntness, their clothes torn and dirty from prolonged exposure to the elements. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12, the youngest perhaps 7, and all of them watched Jake with the wary intelligence of creatures who had learned that survival depended on reading the intentions of every adult they encountered. "Are you the rancher?" the oldest boy asked, his voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible for someone so young. "The one who's losing his land?" Jake stared at them in bewilderment, wondering if exhaustion and despair had finally driven him completely insane. 7 homeless children appearing on his property on the night before he lost everything felt like either a divine joke or a cosmic test he was destined to fail. "How do you know about that?" Jake asked. "We've been watching," another boy replied, this one with bright red hair that seemed to glow in the moonlight. "From the forest, we saw the men in the black cars. We heard them threatening you." The implications of their words settled over Jake like a cold wind. These children had been living in the wilderness, close enough to observe his confrontation with Hartwell, but hidden well enough to avoid detection by trained security professionals. They were either remarkably clever or incredibly lucky, and something in their eyes suggested it was definitely the former. "How long have you been out there?" Jake asked, gesturing toward the dark expanse of whispering pines forest that bordered his property. "Long enough," the oldest boy replied, which wasn't really an answer, but somehow conveyed more information than a detailed explanation. "We know about the wolves. We know about the cold. We know about men who take things that don't belong to them." Jake felt something stir in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in months, the urge to protect something other than his own wounded pride. These children were survivors, but they were also vulnerable in ways that made his own problems seem almost manageable by comparison. Whatever had driven them into the wilderness was probably worse than anything Hartwell could do to him. "Are you hungry?" Jake asked, the question arising from instincts that predated his current crisis by decades. His mother had never let anyone leave their property without a hot meal and a kind word, and some traditions were too deeply ingrained to be abandoned even in the face of personal catastrophe. The children exchanged glances that spoke of internal communication far more sophisticated than anything Jake had expected from people their age. The youngest boy took a small step forward, his hand reaching toward Jake with the tentative trust of a wild animal accepting food from a stranger. "We're always hungry," the boy said simply, and something in his voice broke Jake's heart in a way that all of Hartwell's threats couldn't manage. Jake looked at the 7 faces surrounding him, seeing in their eyes a reflection of his own desperation, tempered by a resilience he envied. Tomorrow he would lose everything he'd ever worked for, but tonight he still had a kitchen full of food and a house with enough space to shelter children who had nowhere else to go. Maybe this was how his story was supposed to end, not with selfish grief over his own losses, but with one final act of generosity toward people who needed help more than he needed self-pity. "Come on," Jake said, turning toward the house. "Let's see what we can find in the kitchen." The children followed him like shadows given substance, their footsteps silent on the frozen ground. As they walked toward the warm glow of the porch light, Jake felt the weight of his problem shifting slightly, making room for concerns that had nothing to do with mortgage payments and everything to do with the fundamental human obligation to care for those who couldn't care for themselves. He didn't know their names or their stories, didn't understand how they'd survived in the wilderness or why they'd chosen to reveal themselves tonight of all nights. But as he opened his front door and ushered them into the warmth of his grandfather's house, Jake realized that for the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about his own death. Instead, he was thinking about how to keep 7 children alive through a Montana winter that would show no mercy to the unprepared. The night was still young, and tomorrow would bring all the same problems that had been crushing him for weeks. But right now, in this moment, Jake Mitchell had a purpose that transcended his own survival. 7 reasons to keep fighting, even if he couldn't quite remember how to win. The fluorescent light above Jake's kitchen table buzzed with the persistence of a dying insect, casting harsh shadows across 7 faces that seemed older than their years warranted. Steam rose from bowls of canned soup and grilled cheese sandwiches that Jake had assembled with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing familiar tasks while his mind grappled with impossible circumstances. The children ate with the focused intensity of creatures who understood that food was never guaranteed, their small hands wrapped around ceramic bowls, as if the warmth might disappear if they loosened their grip. Tommy, the oldest boy who had spoken first outside, sat closest to Jake with the bearing of someone accustomed to being responsible for others. His dark hair hung in his eyes, but nothing could hide the intelligence that burned there like banked coals waiting for the right moment to ignite. He ate slowly, methodically, his gaze constantly shifting between his companions and the man who had offered them sanctuary without asking for explanations. "You don't have to tell me anything," Jake said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled over them like morning fog. "But if you're running from something, from someone, I need to know what I might be dealing with." Sam, a boy with prematurely serious eyes and clothes that had once been expensive before months of wilderness living had reduced them to rags, looked up from his soup. "Are you running from something too?" he asked with the directness that only children could manage without causing offense. The question caught Jake off guard, forcing him to confront the reality that his situation might not be so different from theirs. He was fleeing too, in his own way, though his escape route led through the bottom of a bottle most nights and ended in a hole behind his barn, where he'd planned to bury his dreams. "Yeah," Jake admitted, surprised by how easily the truth emerged. "I guess I am." Bobby, whose freckled face and gap-toothed grin made him look younger than his 9 years, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and spoke up. "The men in the black cars want to take you home. We heard them talking about money and papers and making you leave." Jake nodded, studying the boy's expression for signs of fear or judgment. Instead, he found understanding that ran deeper than sympathy, the kind of recognition that passed between survivors of similar disasters. These children knew about loss in ways that most adults never would, and their presence in his kitchen felt less like coincidence and more like fate arranging pieces on a board he couldn't see. "Where are your families?" Jake asked gently, knowing the question might open wounds that hadn't healed, but needing to understand the scope of the responsibility he was accepting. The twins, Danny and Benny, exchanged glances that spoke of shared secrets and parallel pain. They were mirror images of each other, except for a small scar above Benny's left eyebrow, identical down to the way they both reached for their soup spoons at exactly the same moment. "Foster system," Danny said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather, different homes, different families. "None of them wanted to keep us together. So we left," Benny continued without missing a beat, their conversation flowing with the synchronization of people who had learned to function as two halves of the same whole. "Found each other, found the others. Decided we were better off on our own." Charlie, the smallest at 7 years old, had finished his soup and was now carefully licking the bowl clean with the thoroughness of someone who had learned not to waste a single calorie. His clothes hung loose on his tiny frame, but his eyes held a spark of mischief that suggested his spirit remained unbroken despite whatever hardships had driven him into the forest. "The woods are safer than most houses," Charlie said with the conviction of someone stating an obvious fact. "Trees don't lie to you. Animals don't pretend to care about you and then hurt you when you believe them." Max, who had remained silent throughout the meal, finally spoke up. At 11, he was built like someone who had taken on the role of protector early in life, his shoulders broad for his age and his hands scarred from what looked like defensive wounds. "We've been taking care of ourselves for 4 months. We know how to find food, how to stay warm, how to avoid the people who might want to send us back to places we don't want to go." Jake felt something shift inside his chest, a sensation like ice cracking under pressure. These children had built their own family from the scattered pieces of broken homes and failed systems, creating something stronger than what they'd lost. Their presence in his kitchen wasn't random chance or divine intervention. It was the collision of 2 different kinds of desperation, 2 different forms of homelessness that might somehow solve each other. "How did you know I was in trouble?" Jake asked. Tommy finished his sandwich and leaned back in his chair, studying Jake with the assessment of someone far older than 12. "We've been watching this place for weeks. You work alone, you drink alone, you talk to your cattle like they're the only friends you have left. Yesterday, when those men came with their threats and their papers, we could see you giving up." The accuracy of the observation stung more than Jake cared to admit. He had been giving up, surrendering to forces beyond his control with the resignation of someone who had forgotten how to fight for anything that mattered. But seeing these 7 children who had refused to accept defeat despite facing odds far worse than his own made his surrender seem less like wisdom and more like cowardice. "The hole you were digging," Sam said quietly. "It wasn't for burying something dead, was it?" Jake's throat tightened, making it difficult to swallow the last bite of his sandwich. The boy's insight was uncomfortable in its precision, cutting. Through the self-deception Jake had wrapped around his actions, like armor against his own conscience. "No," Jake admitted, "it wasn't." The kitchen fell silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant howl of wind through the eaves. Outside, storm clouds were gathering, promising the kind of weather that would make survival in the wilderness nearly impossible for anyone without proper shelter. Jake found himself calculating space and resources, wondering if his house could accommodate 7 additional people and whether his dwindling food supplies could stretch to feed them all. "You can't stay in the forest much longer," Jake said, voicing what they all knew but hadn't acknowledged. "Winter's coming hard this year. The wolves are getting bold, and the temperature's going to drop below what human beings can survive without proper equipment." "We know," Tommy replied. "We've been looking for alternatives. Abandoned buildings, empty houses, anywhere we could set up without being discovered. But everything around here is either occupied or watched too closely by people who would ask questions we can't answer." Jake stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark expanse of his property that would belong to Victor Hartwell in less than 24 hours. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was about to lose the one thing these children needed most, and they had appeared just in time to watch it happen. "What if I told you there might be another option?" Jake said slowly, an idea forming in his mind like dawn breaking over the mountains. "Something that might help both of us?" The children's attention focused on him with laser intensity. 7 pairs of eyes that had learned to read adults for signs of false hope or hidden agendas. Jake turned back to face them, feeling the weight of their collective gaze and the responsibility that came with being possibly their last chance at something better than perpetual flight. "Hartwell wants this land for development. He's planning to tear down everything and build some kind of resort for rich tourists who want to play cowboy for a weekend. But there are laws about historical preservation, environmental protection, endangered species habitat. If I could prove that this land needs to be protected." "You could stop him," Max finished, understanding dawning in his expression. "Maybe," Jake said. "But I'd need evidence, documentation, things that would require time and resources. I don't have, unless—" He paused, looking at each child individually before continuing. "Unless I had help from people who know this land better than anyone else. People who've been living in the forest and observing things that bureaucrats in offices would never notice." Tommy leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with calculation. "You want us to help you fight the man who's trying to steal your home." "I want us to help each other," Jake corrected. "You need a place to stay where you won't be found and sent back to situations you escape for good reasons. I need to find a way to save this ranch that doesn't involve surrendering to men like Hartwell. Maybe together we can find solutions that neither of us could manage alone." The proposal hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning a chasm neither side was sure they could cross. Jake was asking these children to trust an adult they barely knew with their freedom and safety. The children were being asked to anchor themselves to a man whose own future was far from secure. But sometimes the most impossible alliances were born from the collision of equally desperate circumstances. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Sam asked with the wariness of someone who had learned that adult promises often came with hidden costs. Jake pulled out a chair and sat back down, meeting each child's gaze as he spoke. "I'm suggesting we become a family. Not the kind that exists on paper or in court documents, but the kind that exists because people choose to take care of each other. You help me save this ranch, and I'll make sure you have a home where nobody can take you away from each other ever again." The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses in their conversation. This silence hummed with possibility and fear in equal measure, the kind of quiet that preceded either breakthrough or heartbreak. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, tapping against the windows with the persistence of time running out. Charlie was the first to speak, his young voice carrying more wisdom than should have been possible. If we help you and it doesn't work, we'll be worse off than we are now. They'll find us, split us up, send us to different places where we'll never see each other again. That's true, Jake acknowledged. But if you keep living in the forest, winter will do worse than split you up. And if I don't try to fight Hartwell, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have saved the only thing that ever mattered to me. Tommy pushed back from the table and walked to the window, staring out at the falling snow that was already beginning to accumulate on the ground. His reflection in the glass looked like a ghost of possibilities that might never be realized, a reminder that childhood was a luxury these 7 had been forced to abandon long before they were ready. "What do you know about us?" Tommy asked, without turning around. "Really no, not just what you can see." Jake considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer would determine whether these children trusted him with their secrets or disappeared back into the wilderness where he would never find them again. "I know you're survivors," Jake said finally. "I know you've learned to take care of each other in ways that most families never manage. I know you're smart enough to have stayed hidden from social services, law enforcement, and whoever else might be looking for you. And I know you're here because something about this place, about tonight, felt like it might be different from all the other dead ends you've encountered." Tommy turned back to face the room, his expression unreadable in the fluorescent light. "We've been on our own for 4 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. In that time, we've had exactly 0 adults offer us anything that didn't come with strings attached or hidden costs. Why should you be different?" The question was fair, and Jake knew his answer would need to be more than words if he wanted these children to believe him. He stood and walked to the kitchen drawer where he kept important documents, pulling out the deed to his property and laying it on the table where everyone could see it. "Because I've got nothing left to lose except this land, and without your help, I'm going to lose it anyway. Because you remind me of why this place matters in the first place. It's supposed to be a home for people who need one. And because 24 hours ago, I was ready to give up on everything. But looking at you 7, I remember what it feels like to want to fight for something worth saving." The deed lay on the table between them like a contract waiting to be signed, its legal language describing boundaries and ownership in terms that had nothing to do with the emotional geography that really mattered. This document represented 4 generations of Mitchell family history, but it also represented the possibility of a future that included 7 children who had nowhere else to go. "If we do this," Danny said, speaking for himself and his twin, "if we help you save this place, what happens after? Do we get to stay, or do we become your temporary problem until you can find somewhere else to dump us?" The question cut to the heart of what Jake was really offering, forcing him to confront whether his proposal was born from genuine care or desperate calculation. He looked at each child individually, seeing in their faces the hope they were trying to hide behind protective skepticism. "You stay," Jake said without hesitation. "This becomes your home for as long as you want it to be. No social services, no foster families, no one splitting you up ever again. We figure out the legalities later, but the commitment starts now." Benny reached across the table and touched the deed with one finger, tracing the property lines that encompassed everything these children had been watching from the forest. 500 acres is a lot of space to hide 7 kids. "It's not about hiding," Jake corrected. "It's about belonging. About having a place where you don't have to run anymore." Max stood and walked to the kitchen door, looking out at the snow that was falling harder now, accumulating with the speed that promised a serious storm. "The men who want to take this place from you, they won't just give up because we find some birds or plants they're not supposed to disturb. They'll fight harder, bring more people, use methods that won't show up in any legal documents." Jake nodded, appreciating the boy's realistic assessment of what they would be facing. "You're right. Hartwell doesn't play by rules when the stakes are high enough. But that's where your advantage comes in. You know how to be invisible, how to move through terrain without being detected, how to gather information without being discovered. Those are skills that could make the difference between winning and losing. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made everyone in the kitchen freeze, the distant rumble of engines approaching the house. Jake's blood turned to ice water as he recognized the distinctive purr of expensive vehicles moving slowly across gravel, their drivers taking their time to make their presence known and intimidating. Tommy was at the window in seconds, his body pressed against the wall as he peered through the curtains without exposing himself to view. 3 vehicles, same as before. But they're moving differently this time, like they're not planning to leave. Jake's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Hartwell had said he had until sunset to make his decision, but the sun had set hours ago while they'd been talking in the kitchen. Either the man had decided Jake's silence was answer enough, or something else had prompted this nighttime visit that would bring complications none of them were prepared to handle. "Back door," Jake whispered urgently, but Tommy shook his head. "Too late. They've got the house surrounded." 2 men moving around back, 2 more heading for the front porch, at least one staying with the vehicles as backup. The tactical assessment from a 12-year-old should have been surprising, but Jake was beginning to understand that these children had learned survival skills that most adults never acquired. They had been hunted before by different predators, in different circumstances, and their knowledge might be the only thing standing between all of them and disaster. "How long do we have?" Jake asked. 30 seconds, maybe less," Sam replied from his position near the living room entrance. "They're not trying to be quiet anymore." The heavy footsteps on the front porch confirmed Sam's assessment, followed by pounding on the door that shook the entire frame. Hartwell's voice cut through the night with the authority of someone accustomed to having his demands met immediately. "Mitchell, I know you're in there. We need to talk, now." Jake looked at the 7 faces surrounding him, seeing his own fear reflected in their eyes, but also something else. Determination that came from people who had faced worse situations and survived. Whatever happened next, these children wouldn't abandon him to face it alone. That knowledge gave him strength he hadn't felt in months. "Stay here," Jake whispered to the children. "Don't come out no matter what you hear. If things go bad, use the cellar door in the pantry. It leads to tunnels my grandfather dug during Prohibition. Follow them east until you reach the old mine shaft, then head for the deep forest. We're not leaving you," Charlie said with the fierce loyalty of someone who had learned that family meant never abandoning each other when danger arrived. "You will if I tell you to," Jake replied firmly. "Because that's what family does. They protect each other, even when it hurts." The pounding on the door intensified, accompanied by the sound of multiple voices conferring in urgent whispers. Jake straightened his shoulders, walked to the front door, and prepared to face whatever Victor Hartwell had brought to his doorstep in the middle of a snowstorm that was beginning to look like the least of their problems. Jake's hand trembled as he reached for the door handle, not from fear but from rage that had been building like pressure in a boiler for months. Through the frosted glass panels flanking his front door, he could see the distorted silhouettes of at least 4 men, their breath creating clouds in the freezing air as they waited for him to submit to their midnight intimidation. The porch light cast harsh shadows across their faces when he finally opened the door, revealing expressions that held no pretense of civility or legal procedure. Victor Hartwell stood at the center of the group like a general surrounded by his lieutenants, his expensive overcoat dusted with snow and his eyes glittering with the cold satisfaction of a predator who had cornered wounded prey. Behind him, 3 men in tactical gear carried weapons that were clearly visible despite the late hour and residential setting. This wasn't a business meeting. It was a show of force designed to eliminate any remaining resistance Jake might have. "Harbored. You missed our deadline, Mitchell," Hartwell said without preamble. his breath forming white clouds that dissipated in the wind like the last remnants of Jake's hope. Sunset came and went without an answer, which means you've made your choice. Unfortunately, it was the wrong one. Jake stepped onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind him to prevent these men from seeing into his house where 7 children waited in terrified silence. The cold bit through his flannel shirt like teeth, but he refused to show any sign of discomfort that might be interpreted as weakness. "Last I checked, we agreed on 30 days, Jake said, keeping his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Seems to me you're the one breaking agreements." Hartwell's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Circumstances have accelerated, my friend. You see, I've discovered some very interesting information about your financial situation. It turns out you've been hiding assets, trying to shield money from your creditors in violation of your loan agreements." The accusation hit Jake like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because he understood the implications immediately. Hartwell had manufactured evidence of fraud that would justify immediate seizure of the property, bypassing the normal foreclosure process and any legal protections Jake might have claimed. It was the kind of sophisticated criminal manipulation that came with unlimited resources and complete disregard for the law. "That's impossible," Jake said. "Every penny I have is accounted for. Every transaction has been documented and reported." "Oh, I'm sure your books look clean," Hartwell agreed with mock sympathy. "But electronic records can be so unreliable these days. Bank transfers that appear legitimate on the surface, but reveal their true nature under closer examination. Offshore accounts that somehow escaped initial scrutiny. Amazing what a thorough investigation can uncover when someone knows where to look." Jake's hands clenched into fists at his sides as the full scope of Hartwell's scheme became clear. The man hadn't just been planning to foreclose on the ranch. He had been actively constructing a criminal case that would justify seizure of assets and potentially put Jake in prison, where he couldn't interfere with future development plans. It was character assassination backed by fabricated evidence, and implemented with the efficiency of someone who had destroyed lives for profit countless times before. "You can't prove something that never happened," Jake said, but his voice lacked the conviction he wished he could summon. "Can't I?" Hartwell reached into his coat and withdrew a tablet computer, its screen glowing with what appeared to be bank statements and transaction records. 3 transfers totaling $47,000 to an account in the Cayman Islands, all initiated from your home computer using your personal login credentials. Quite clever, really, trying to hide money offshore while claiming poverty to your creditors. Jake stared at the fabricated documents with a mixture of admiration and horror. The forgeries were sophisticated enough to fool casual inspection, complete with timestamps, account numbers, and digital signatures that would appear legitimate to anyone who wasn't a forensic accountant. Hartwell had spent considerable time and money creating evidence that could destroy Jake's life with surgical precision. "Those records are fake," Jake said. "Any competent investigation would prove that." "Perhaps," Hartwell conceded. "But investigations take time, and during that time, your assets would be frozen pending resolution of the criminal charges. Your ranch would be placed in receivership, managed by a court-appointed administrator who would coincidentally be very interested in selling the property quickly to recover the stolen funds." The elegant brutality of the plan took Jake's breath away. Hartwell had created a legal maze that would trap him regardless of his innocence, using the justice system itself as a weapon to achieve what simple foreclosure couldn't accomplish. Even if Jake eventually proved his innocence, it would take years and resources he didn't possess, during which time the ranch would be lost and his reputation destroyed. "What do you want?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. "Immediate transfer of the deed, signed tonight, with you voluntarily relinquishing all claims to the property in exchange for my agreement not to pursue criminal charges." Hartwell's tone was businesslike, as if they were discussing the sale of livestock rather than the destruction of a man's entire life. You walk away clean, no prison time, no criminal record, just the understanding that you've learned the cost of refusing reasonable offers. Behind Jake, the house remained silent, but he could feel the presence of 7 children who were depending on him to find a way out of this nightmare. Their faith in his ability to protect them added weight to his decision that had nothing to do with his own survival and everything to do with people who had already lost too much to lose anything more. "And if I refuse?" Jake asked. "Then my associates here will assist me in conducting a citizen's arrest, while we wait for the sheriff's department to arrive with formal charges. You'll spend the night in jail, possibly longer depending on how quickly you can arrange bail, and by morning, this property will be under court protection pending resolution of your case." One of Hartwell's men shifted position slightly, his hand moving closer to the weapon, holstered at his side. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakable, a reminder that Jake was outnumbered and outgunned by people who had no qualms about using violence to achieve their objectives. The pretense of legality was paper-thin, barely concealing the criminal enterprise underneath. Jake glanced back at his house, its windows glowing with warm yellow light that represented everything he had ever worked to build and protect. Somewhere inside, 7 children waited for him to prove that adults could be trusted to keep their promises, and that home was more than just a word used to manipulate vulnerable people. He couldn't let them down, not when they had already been failed by every other adult who had claimed to care about their welfare. "I need a minute," Jake said. "You need to make a decision," Hartwell corrected. "Right now tonight with my patients. Wearing thin and my associates getting cold. Choose quickly, Mitchell, because the longer this takes, the less generous I'm feeling about your future prospects." Jake turned away from the group and walked to the edge of his porch, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that stretched away into darkness. The storm was intensifying, turning what had been gentle flakes into driving sheets of white that reduced visibility to a few yards. In weather like this, anyone caught in the open would be in serious danger, but the same conditions that threatened exposure also provided cover for movements that needed to remain undetected. A sound reached him through the wind, so faint it might have been imagination, the crack of a branch breaking under weight that had no business being there. Jake's eyes strained against the darkness, searching for movement in the swirling snow, but seeing nothing except the shapes his mind might have been creating from fear and desperation. Then he heard it again, closer this time, followed by what sounded like a whistle that lasted exactly 2 seconds before the wind swallowed it. Tommy's voice echoed in his memory, describing skills that these children had learned during 4 months of surviving in conditions that would challenge experienced wilderness experts. They knew how to move unseen, how to gather information without being detected, how to use terrain and weather to their advantage in ways that trained adults often missed. If they were out there in the storm, they weren't hiding from the danger. They were positioning themselves to influence its outcome. "Time's up, Mitchell," Hartwell called from behind him. "Make your choice." Jake turned back to face the group, his expression carefully neutral despite the plan that was forming in his mind. "You said you wanted the deed signed tonight. I assume you brought the paperwork?" Hartwell's smile widened with the satisfaction of victory achieved through superior force and planning. "Of course. My legal team prepared all the necessary documents earlier today, anticipating that you would eventually see reason." One of Hartwell's associates produced a briefcase from the porch shadows, its contents presumably containing the contracts that would legally transfer ownership of Mitchell Ranch to the man who had orchestrated its theft through fraud and intimidation. The papers represented the culmination of months of pressure and manipulation, the final step in a process that had been designed to appear legitimate while employing methods that were anything but. "I'll need to read through everything," Jake said, Make sure I understand exactly what I'm signing." "By all means," Hartwell agreed magnanimously. "Though I should mention that the terms are non-negotiable. You sign as written, or we proceed with the criminal charges. Those are your only options." Jake nodded as if accepting the inevitable, but his attention was focused on sounds that only he seemed to notice: the soft whisper of movement through snow, the creak of boards that might have been settling or might have been weight distribution, the kind of atmospheric disturbances that could be explained by weather or by 7 children who had learned to use the environment as both shield and weapon. The briefcase opened with a metallic click that seemed unnaturally loud in the storm-muffled night. Hartwell withdrew a folder thick with legal documents, each page marked with yellow tabs indicating where Jake's signature would be required. The paperwork was comprehensive, covering not just the transfer of land ownership, but also statements acknowledging his guilt in the fabricated fraud case and agreements that would prevent him from challenging the transaction in any future legal proceedings. "Quite thorough," Jake observed, flipping through pages of dense legal text that had clearly been prepared by attorneys who specialized in making theft appear legitimate. "I believe in covering all possible contingencies," Hartwell replied. "Sign where indicated, initial the amendments, and this unpleasant business can be concluded quickly." Jake picked up the pen that Hartwell offered, weighing it in his hand, as if considering the gravity of what he was about to do. In reality, he was listening for sounds that would tell him whether the children were in position for whatever plan they had conceived, assuming they had conceived a plan and weren't simply watching his surrender from the safety of the storm. A sharp whistle cut through the wind, lasting exactly 3 seconds this time before fading into the background noise of the blizzard. Jake couldn't see the source, but the signal was clear enough to someone who had learned to interpret Tommy's communications during their brief conversation in the kitchen. Whatever was about to happen, it would begin now. Jake raised the pen toward the first signature line, then stopped as if struck by a sudden thought. "You know, there's something I've been wondering about. How did you manage to fabricate bank records so quickly? That kind of sophisticated fraud usually takes weeks to develop properly." Hartwell's expression flickered with annoyance at the delay, but his confidence remained unshaken. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Those records were uncovered through routine investigation of your financial affairs." "Right," Jake said slowly. "Routine investigation. By whom, exactly? Because I'd love to know which law enforcement agency has been monitoring my personal banking without a warrant or probable cause." The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had been fired but hadn't yet found its target. Hartwell's smile faltered slightly as he realized Jake was probing the weakest point in his fabricated case, the chain of custody that would explain how criminal evidence had been obtained through legal means. "Private investigators working on behalf of your creditors," Hartwell said after a pause that lasted a beat too long. "Perfectly legal when there's suspicion of hidden assets." "Interesting," Jake mused. "Because private investigators don't have access to bank records without court orders. And court orders require evidence of probable cause that would need to be documented in public filings. I don't suppose you have copies of those court orders?" The silence that followed Jake's question was filled with the sound of wind driving snow against the house and the subtle shift of weight as Hartwell's associates realized their boss was being challenged by someone who understood more about legal procedure than they had anticipated. Jake wasn't a lawyer, but he had spent enough time fighting his father's medical bills and insurance claims to learn how the system worked when someone was trying to manipulate it. "You're stalling," Hartwell said, his voice harder now. "Sign the papers, Mitchell, or face the consequences." Jake looked down at the pen in his hand, then back up at the faces surrounding him on his own porch. "You know what I think? I think you've been so focused on stealing my land that you forgot to make sure your story would hold up under scrutiny. I think those bank records will fall apart the moment a real investigator looks at them. And I think you've just committed several felonies in front of witnesses who might not be as loyal as you believe." The words were a gamble, based on nothing more than Jake's intuitive understanding that criminals often made mistakes when they believed victory was assured. But the way Hartwell's expression tightened suggested the accusation had found its mark, exposing vulnerabilities in a plan that had seemed foolproof only moments before. "Last chance, Mitchell," Hartwell snarled, dropping any pretense of civility. "Sign the papers or my associates will ensure your compliance through alternative methods." The threat was explicit now, stripping away the legal facade to reveal the violence that had always been lurking underneath. Hartwell's men moved into positions that would allow them to overwhelm Jake quickly and efficiently, their hands resting on weapons that would end any resistance before it could begin. The porch had become a stage set for brutality disguised as business. That's when the lights went out. The power failure was sudden and complete, plunging the entire property into darkness that was made absolute by the blizzard conditions. Jake had been expecting something, but the coordinated precision of the blackout suggested planning and execution that went far beyond anything he had imagined 7 children could accomplish. Emergency lighting should have activated within seconds. But even the backup systems remained dark, indicating sabotage that required sophisticated understanding of electrical infrastructure. Shouts erupted from Hartwell's men as they found themselves blind and disoriented in hostile territory during a snowstorm that had eliminated most of their operational advantages. Flashlights clicked on and swept across the porch, but the beams only served to create deeper shadows and confuse depth perception in the swirling snow. The carefully orchestrated intimidation had become chaos in the span of a single heartbeat. "What the hell is happening?" Hartwell's voice cut through the calm though. Darkness with the panic of someone who had lost control of a situation he had spent months planning. Jake smiled in the darkness, finally understanding that he wasn't facing this alone. 7 children who had learned to survive against impossible odds had become his allies in a fight that would determine whether home was something worth defending, or just another word that powerful men used to justify theft. The battle for Mitchell Ranch had begun, and for the first time in months, Jake liked his chances. The darkness that enveloped Mitchell Ranch was not the simple absence of light, but something far more sophisticated, a tactical advantage that had been planned and executed with precision that would have impressed military strategists. Jake stood motionless on his porch as chaos erupted around him, understanding that 7 children had just declared war on Victor Hartwell using weapons that no adult would have considered. Intimate knowledge of terrain, supernatural ability to move unseen, and the kind of desperation that transformed ordinary people into forces of nature. Hartwell's flashlight beam swept across the porch in erratic arcs, revealing nothing but empty space where his associates had been standing moments before. The wind carried sounds that might have been shouts, or might have been the storm itself. But no human voices responded to his increasingly frantic calls for status reports. In the span of 30 seconds, he had gone from predator to prey without understanding how the transformation had occurred. "Mitchell!" Hartwell's voice cracked with fury and growing fear. "What have you done?" Jake remained silent, partly because he didn't know what to say, and partly because he was beginning to understand that silence itself was a weapon in this kind of warfare. The children had taught him something important without saying a word. Sometimes the most effective response to overwhelming force was to let that force destroy itself through its own momentum and overconfidence. A sharp crack echoed through the storm, followed immediately by a scream of pain that was definitely human. One of Hartwell's men had encountered something unexpected in the darkness, something that had left him injured and calling for help that wasn't coming. The sound was cut off abruptly, replaced by the kind of silence that suggested unconsciousness rather than compliance. "Richardson!" Hartwell called into the night. "Rodriguez!" Report your status immediately. No response came except the wind and the steady accumulation of snow that was beginning to make movement treacherous for anyone who didn't know the ground intimately. Jake's property had become a maze of invisible obstacles and hidden dangers, terrain that favored defenders who had spent months learning every tree, every slope, every place where the unwary might stumble and fall. Another sound reached them. Through the storm, the distinctive whistle of something moving fast through the air, followed by the metallic clang of impact against one of the vehicles. Hartwell's head snapped toward the parking area where his SUVs waited, their engines still running but their drivers nowhere to be seen. A second projectile struck the lead vehicle with enough force to shatter a headlight, sending sparks cascading across the snow. The morning after the power outage brought crystalline silence that stretched across Pine Ridge Valley like a held breath. Jake stood at his kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his hands as he surveyed the aftermath of what had happened in the darkness. 3 abandoned SUVs sat in his driveway, their doors hanging open like the mouths of surprised corpses, while scattered footprints in the snow told a story of confusion and retreat that ended abruptly at the tree line where the forest had swallowed Victor Hartwell and his remaining men. The 7 children sat around his kitchen table with the calm satisfaction of generals reviewing a successful campaign. Their clothes were still damp from the storm, but their eyes held the bright alertness of people who had discovered they were far more capable than anyone had given them credit for. Tommy traced patterns in spilled sugar while he spoke, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting routine maintenance rather than tactical victory. Hartwell made it to the county road before his hypothermia got bad enough to stop him, Tommy said without looking up from his improvised map. Sam and Bobby followed him to make sure he didn't double back, but he kept going straight toward town. Probably spent the night in his car with the heater running. Jake set down his coffee cup with hands that were steadier than they had been in months. What about his men? Bull Morrison has a dislocated shoulder and a concussion from walking into a rope we strung between 2 trees. Danny reported with the clinical detachment of a field medic. He's alive but not feeling particularly loyal to his employer right now. We left him zip-tied to a tree about half a mile into the forest where the search teams will find him eventually. Frank Stevens lost his weapon and his radio when he fell through the ice on Copper Creek, Benny continued seamlessly. The water's only 3 feet deep there, but it's cold enough to make hypothermia a serious concern. He made it out but kept walking until he was off the property. Haven't seen him since. Max leaned back in his chair, studying Jake's expression for signs of disapproval or moral concern. Pete Collins is the one who screamed. He stepped in a hunting trap we modified to catch ankles instead of killing animals. No permanent damage, but he won't be walking normally for a few weeks. We cut him loose after he promised to tell Hartwell that this property is protected by forces he doesn't understand. The efficiency of their operation impressed Jake more than he cared to admit. These children had neutralized 4 armed adults using nothing but knowledge of their environment and the kind of tactical thinking that came from months of staying 1 step ahead of people who wanted to capture them. They had turned his ranch into a fortress without firing a shot or causing permanent injury to anyone, demonstrating restraint that professional soldiers might have envied. You could have killed them, Jake observed. We could have, Charlie agreed, his young voice carrying implications that made Jake's blood run cold. But dead bodies bring investigators, and investigators ask questions we can't answer. Better to let them go home with stories that make them sound crazy. The wisdom behind the strategy was undeniable, but it also revealed depths to these children that Jake was only beginning to understand. They weren't just survivors. They were strategists who had learned to think several moves ahead of their opponents, planning not just for immediate victory, but for long-term security that required their enemies to discredit themselves. Sam finished his bowl of cereal and looked directly at Jake. Hartwell will be back, Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but he'll be back with more men and better equipment. What happened last night was just the opening round. Jake nodded, accepting the reality that his quiet life as a failing rancher had ended the moment he chose to protect 7 children, who had nowhere else to go. What do you suggest we do about it? We make this place into somewhere Hartwell can't take, Tommy said, his finger tracing defensive positions on the sugar map he had created. Not just physically, though that's part of it. We make it legally untouchable, politically dangerous for him to attack, socially costly for him to be associated with. The scope of what Tommy was suggesting took Jake's breath away. These children weren't thinking about hiding or running. They were planning to transform his failing ranch into a fortress that could withstand assault from someone with virtually unlimited resources and no moral constraints. It was either the most brilliant strategy Jake had ever heard or the most impossibly naive. How exactly do we accomplish that? Jake asked. Research, Max said simply. Hartwell's been buying up land all over this county for the past 5 years, but he hasn't been doing it cleanly. Every time someone refuses to sell, they end up facing exactly the same kind of problems you've been dealing with: mysterious financial irregularities, criminal accusations that appear out of nowhere, pressure that escalates until they have no choice but to surrender. You think he's been doing this to other people? Jake felt a surge of anger at the thought that families like his had been systematically destroyed by a man who treated human suffering as acceptable overhead in his business model. We know he has, Bobby said with certainty that came from firsthand observation. We've been watching this area for months, remember? We saw what happened to the Henderson place, the Parker Ranch, at least 3 other properties that are now owned by shell companies connected to Hartwell's Development Corporation. The pattern is always the same, Sam continued. Financial pressure, legal harassment, threats that escalate until the targets give up and sell. But patterns create evidence, and evidence creates vulnerability for people who think they're above the law. Jake stared at the children around his table, realizing that he had been thinking too small about both the problem and the solution. Hartwell wasn't just trying to steal one ranch. He was systematically acquiring an entire valley through methods that bordered on organized crime. Fighting him would require more than just defending a single piece of property. It would require exposing an operation that had been destroying families for years. What kind of evidence would we need? Jake asked. Financial records showing the pattern of acquisitions and the shell companies involved, Tommy said, counting on his fingers. Documentation of the harassment campaigns against previous targets. Proof that the criminal accusations against you and others were fabricated. Testimony from victims who might be willing to speak if they knew they weren't alone. And where exactly are we supposed to find this information? Jake's question carried skepticism born from understanding how well-connected men like Hartwell protected their secrets. From Hartwell himself, Charlie said with the kind of smile that belonged on the face of someone much older and considerably more dangerous. He keeps files on all his targets, all his shell companies, all his methods. Has to, for tax purposes and corporate planning. The files exist. We just have to figure out where he keeps them and how to access them. The audacity of what the boy was suggesting made Jake's head spin. You're talking about breaking into the offices of one of the most powerful men in Montana. The security alone would be impossible to overcome, not to mention the legal consequences if we were caught. We wouldn't be caught, Max said with quiet confidence. Adults think in terms of locks and alarms and security cameras. They don't think about 7-year-olds who can crawl through ventilation systems or 12-year-olds who understand computer networks better than most IT professionals. Jake looked around the table at faces that were far too young to be discussing corporate espionage with the casual expertise of seasoned criminals. These children had been forced to develop skills that most people never acquired because they're Survival had depended on staying ahead of systems designed to control and contain them. What they were proposing was dangerous beyond measure, but it might also be the only way to save not just his ranch but every other family that Hartwell was targeting for destruction. Even if we could get the evidence, Jake said slowly, what would we do with it? Hartwell has enough money to buy lawyers who could tie up any legal challenge for years. We don't go to lawyers, Tommy said. We go to journalists. Investigative reporters who specialize in exposing corruption. People who understand that a story about systematic theft and fraud by a powerful developer would be worth more than anything Hartwell could pay them to kill it. And we go to other victims, Danny added. People who gave up fighting Hartwell because they thought they were alone. Show them they're part of a pattern. Give them evidence that proves they were targeted. And some of them will be angry enough to join a class action lawsuit that Hartwell can't buy his way out of. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its scope. Instead of trying to defend against Hartwell's attacks, they would turn his own methods against him, using his pattern of systematic fraud to destroy his credibility and legal standing. It was the kind of plan that could either save them all or result in consequences that would make Hartwell's current threats seem gentle by comparison. How long would something like this take? Jake asked. Weeks, maybe months, Sam admitted. Depends on how well Hartwell has hidden his files and how quickly we can build a coalition of victims willing to go public. But we don't have to wait until it's finished to start using what we find. Every piece of evidence we gather makes us harder to attack and gives us more leverage to negotiate. Jake stood and walked to the window again, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that represented 4 generations of his family's dreams and sacrifices. The children were offering him a chance to fight back, but the price would be transforming his quiet ranch into the headquarters of a war against one of the most powerful men in the state. The risks were enormous, but the alternative was surrender. That would mean losing everything anyway. What about you? Jake asked without turning around. If we do this, if we go after Hartwell directly, you'll be putting yourselves in more danger than you've ever faced. He won't just try to take my land. He'll try to destroy anyone who helps me. That includes 7 children who are supposed to be invisible to the systems that are looking for them. We stopped being invisible the moment we chose to help you. Tommy said quietly, Hartwell saw us last night, even if he doesn't understand what he saw. We're committed now whether we want to be or not. Besides, Charlie added with the kind of wisdom that should have been impossible at his age, we've been running from people who wanted to control us our whole lives. Maybe it's time to stop running and start fighting. The decision hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that could either warm them or burn down everything they had built. Jake turned back to face the 7 faces that were watching him with expressions that mixed hope and determination in equal measure. These children had already risked everything to help him. Now he had to decide whether he was willing to risk everything to help them build something better than what they were running from. If we do this, Jake said slowly, we do it as a family. No secrets, no individual decisions that affect the group. No one taking unnecessary risks without consulting the others first. We succeed together or we fail together, but we don't abandon each other no matter what happens. The agreement that passed between them was wordless but absolute, the kind of commitment that transformed strangers into something deeper than blood relatives. They were 8 people who had found each other at the moment when surrender seemed like the only option, and together they had discovered that surrender was just another word for giving up on the possibility that home could be something worth fighting for. So what's our first move? Jake asked. Tommy's smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. We start by finding out everything there is to know about Victor Hartwell's business empire. Where his offices are, who works for him, how his security systems function, what his daily routines look like. You can't attack a fortress until you know where the walls are weakest. I can help with that, Jake said, feeling something awakening inside him that had been dormant for months. I know people in town who've had dealings with Hartwell, people who might be willing to share information if they think it could help stop him from destroying more families. And we'll handle the technical aspects, Max said with the quiet confidence of someone who understood systems that most adults found incomprehensible. Computer networks, security cameras, alarm systems, anything that runs on electricity or connects to the internet. There's always a way in if you know where to look. The plan was beginning to take shape like a photograph developing in a darkroom, details emerging from shadows that had seemed impenetrable only moments before. Jake felt his heart beating faster as he contemplated the magnitude of what they were proposing, but for the first time in months, the acceleration came from excitement rather than fear. "How soon can we start?" Jake asked. "We already have," Sam said, producing a laptop computer from seemingly nowhere. "While you were making coffee, we were gathering preliminary intelligence about Hartwell's corporate structure. Turns out he's not as careful about digital security as he thinks he is." Jake stared at the screen that Sam turned toward him, seeing financial documents and corporate filings that should have been protected by layers of security, but were apparently accessible to 11-year-olds who understood technology better than the people trying to hide behind it. The information was damning even at first glance, showing patterns of land acquisition and financial manipulation that would make front-page news if it ever reached the right journalists. "This is just the beginning," Tommy said, his voice carrying the promise of revelations that would shake the foundations of Hartwell's empire. "By the time we're finished, Victor Hartwell is going to wish he had never heard of Mitchell Ranch." The abandoned mining office on the outskirts of Silver Falls had been empty for 15 years, but in the 3 weeks since Jake and the children had claimed it as their base of operations, it had been transformed into something that resembled a military command center crossed with a research library. Maps covered every available wall surface, showing property boundaries, corporate ownership records, and timelines that traced Hartwell's acquisitions across Pine Ridge Valley with the precision of epidemiologists tracking a disease outbreak. Jake stood before the largest map, a detailed survey of the entire county that Tommy had somehow acquired from the courthouse records office, studying patterns that had become disturbingly clear once someone took the time to look for them. Red pins marked properties that Hartwell had acquired in the past 5 years. Yellow pins showed properties currently under financial pressure, and blue pins indicated families who had fought back and lost everything in the process. The visual representation was devastating in its clarity. Hartwell wasn't just buying land. He was systematically depopulating an entire region. 37 families, Danny said from his position at a table covered with financial documents. That's how many people have lost their homes to Hartwell's operation in the past 5 years. Some sold voluntarily after facing bankruptcy. Others were forced out through foreclosure or criminal charges that disappeared after the property changed hands. The average payout was 63% of assessed value, Benny continued, his twin's ability to process numbers making him invaluable for analyzing the financial aspects of Hartwell's scheme. Which means he's been stealing approximately 40% of the value from every transaction. Money that should have gone to families who spent generations building these places. Jake felt his anger building as he contemplated the human cost of Hartwell's ambition. Each pin on the map represented dreams destroyed, legacies erased, families scattered to cities where they would never again know the satisfaction of working land that belonged to them. The scope of the destruction was breathtaking in its callous efficiency. "What about resistance?" Jake asked. "Did anyone try to organize opposition to what was happening?" 3 attempts, Max replied from his station near a bank of computer monitors that hummed with the quiet efficiency of machines processing vast amounts of data. Tom Henderson tried to organize a property owners association in 2021, But it fell apart after he started facing IRS audits and environmental violations that had never existed before. Sarah Parker hired a lawyer to challenge Hartwell's acquisition methods, but her attorney withdrew from the case after receiving threats against his family. The third attempt was led by a rancher named Bill Kowalski, Sam added, pulling up newspaper articles on one of the monitors. He actually made it to the state legislature with evidence of fraudulent foreclosure proceedings. The day before his scheduled testimony, his barn burned down with 50 head of cattle inside. The fire was ruled accidental, but Kowalski sold his land to Hartwell the following week. The pattern was clear. Hartwell dealt with organized resistance through escalating violence that was always designed to look accidental or unavoidable. Anyone who tried to expose his methods found themselves facing personal disasters that consumed their attention and resources until fighting back became impossible. It was psychological warfare implemented with corporate precision and criminal ruthlessness. What makes us different? Jake asked, voicing the question that had been haunting him for days. Why do we think we can succeed where 37 other families failed? Because we're not fighting alone, Tommy said, looking up from a pile of legal documents he had been studying. And because we're not fighting fair. The distinction was important in ways that Jake was only beginning to understand. Previous resistance efforts had tried to use legitimate channels to expose illegitimate behavior, operating within systems that Hartwell controlled or influenced. But 7 children who had learned to survive outside those systems brought capabilities that no law-abiding adult would possess or consider using. "Tell me what you've found," Jake said, settling into a chair that had become his command post. During their daily intelligence briefings, Charlie spread a collection of photographs across the table, images that had been taken with telephoto lenses from positions that should have been impossible for children to access. They showed Hartwell's offices, his security arrangements, his daily routines, and the faces of people who worked for him in various capacities. The surveillance was comprehensive and professionally executed, revealing vulnerabilities that would have taken trained investigators weeks to identify. Hartwell's main offices are on the 7th floor of the Pinnacle building in Helena, Charlie reported with the efficiency of a reconnaissance specialist. Standard corporate security, key card access, cameras in public areas, motion sensors after hours. But the building was constructed in 1987, which means the ventilation system is oversized by modern standards and connects to areas that aren't covered by surveillance. His personal security consists of 2 bodyguards who accompany him during business hours and a residential alarm system at his house that was installed by a company that went out of business 3 years ago. Bobby continued. The alarm system hasn't been updated since installation, which means it's running software that has known vulnerabilities. Jake stared at the photographs, trying to reconcile the children's casual discussion of infiltration techniques with the fact that the oldest among them was barely a teenager. How do you know all this? Because staying hidden from people who want to find you teaches you to notice things that others miss, Max explained. Security systems are designed to stop adults who think like adults. They're not designed to stop children who can fit through spaces that grown-ups don't even see. And because most security is about looking impressive rather than being effective, Sam added. Hartwell wants people to think his operation is untouchable, so he invests in visible deterrence rather than actual protection. It's like putting a big lock on a door while leaving the windows open. The tactical assessment was delivered with matter-of-fact precision that made Jake wonder what other skills these children had acquired during their months in the wilderness. They spoke about infiltration and surveillance as if discussing household chores, their expertise born from necessity rather than training, but no less effective for its unconventional origins. What about the files we need? Jake asked. Any idea where Hartwell keeps the records that would prove his operation is criminal? 3 locations, Tommy said. consulting notes written in a code that looked like random symbols but apparently conveyed detailed information. His main office. Computer, which contains correspondence and financial records going back 7 years. A fireproof safe in his home study that holds physical documents, including contracts and legal agreements. And a safety deposit box at First National Bank where he keeps backup copies of the most sensitive material. The computer would be easiest to access remotely if we could get someone inside his office with the right equipment, Max said. But remote access leaves digital footprints that could be traced back to us. Better to physically copy the files using methods that don't create electronic evidence. The home safe would require more traditional burglary skills, but residential security is usually weaker than corporate security, Bobby added. Especially for someone who could enter through spaces that weren't designed to accommodate human beings. The safety deposit box would be the most difficult target, but also the most valuable, Danny concluded. Banks have multiple layers of security, but they also have predictable routines that create opportunities for someone who understands how the system works. Jake listened to their assessment with growing amazement at the complexity of what they were proposing. These children were discussing a coordinated intelligence operation that would make professional spies envious, planning to infiltrate secure locations and extract evidence that could destroy one of the most powerful men in Montana. The audacity was breathtaking, but so was their apparent competence. "This is incredibly dangerous," Jake said, feeling obligated to voice concerns that the children seemed to have dismissed. "If you're caught, the consequences won't be limited to juvenile detention. Hartwell has enough influence to ensure that anyone who threatens him faces adult charges regardless of their age. Everything we've done since we left the foster system has been incredibly dangerous," Charlie replied with the calm acceptance of someone who had learned to live with permanent risk. "At least this time we're choosing the danger instead of having it chosen for us. And we're fighting for something instead of just running from something," Tommy added. "That makes the risk worth taking." Jake studied the faces around him, seeing determination that came from people who had already lost everything once and refused to accept that fate a second time. These children were offering to stake their freedom, possibly their lives, on a plan that could either save his ranch or destroy them all. The weight of their trust was almost unbearable. "What do you need from me?" Jake asked. "Information about Hartwell's business relationships in town," Sam said. "Who he deals with, which banks he uses, which lawyers handle his contracts. The kind of local intelligence that can only come from someone who's lived here long enough to understand how the community works. And a cover story that explains why you're suddenly spending time in Helena asking questions about corporate security," Max added. "Something that would justify your presence in places where reconnaissance needs to happen. Also someone to handle negotiations with the journalists who will eventually publish what we find," Tommy said. "Children can gather evidence, but adults are more credible when it comes to presenting it to people who can use it effectively." The division of labor made sense from a practical standpoint, but it also meant that Jake would be taking responsibility for aspects of the operation that could result in criminal charges if anything went wrong. He would be the adult face of a conspiracy led by children, accepting legal liability for actions that he might not even witness firsthand. "When do we start?" Jake asked, making the decision that would transform him from victim to active participant in a war he was no longer sure he understood. "We already have," Bobby said with a grin that belonged on the face of someone planning a particularly elaborate practical joke. "Charlie and I spent yesterday mapping the security arrangements at the Pinnacle building. Max has been monitoring Hartwell's electronic communications for patterns we can exploit. Tommy and Sam have been researching the backgrounds of everyone who works for Hartwell's various companies. And Danny and Benny have been analyzing financial records to identify which accounts contain the most damaging evidence." Sam added, "By the time you finish making contact with your sources in town, will be ready to begin active operations. Jake looked around the abandoned mining office that had become the headquarters of a resistance movement he hadn't known he was joining. Maps and documents covered every surface. Computer monitors glowed with data that could expose years of systematic fraud. And 7 children who should have been in school were instead planning an operation that would have challenged experienced intelligence professionals. "What are our chances?" Jake asked. "Better than they were a month ago when you were digging your own grave," Tommy replied with brutal honesty. "Worse than they'll be once we start using what Hartwell has taught us about fighting dirty." The assessment was neither encouraging nor discouraging, just realistic in the way that came from people who had learned to evaluate odds without letting hope or fear cloud their judgment. These children had survived by understanding that success was never guaranteed, but always possible for people willing to do whatever was necessary to achieve it. "Then let's find out what we're really fighting," Jake said, standing and walking to the map that showed Hartwell's empire spreading across Pine Ridge Valley like a cancer. "And let's find out whether 7 kids and a rancher can bring down someone who thinks he's untouchable." The November sky above Helena hung low and gray like a bruise that refused to heal, promising snow that would arrive with the kind of persistence that shut down schools and businesses across Montana. Jake sat in his truck outside the Pinnacle building, watching office workers hurry past with the urgent determination of people racing against weather that would trap them if they hesitated too long. The storm approaching from the west was more than just meteorological. It was tactical cover for an operation that would begin in 3 hours and either end with evidence that could destroy Victor Hartwell or with 8 people facing consequences that would make their current problems seem insignificant. His radio crackled with the voice of Tommy, who was positioned on the roof of a building 6 blocks away with sight lines to every entrance of Hartwell's corporate headquarters. Security shift change completed at 1400 hours. New guards are following standard protocols, checking identification but not verifying against employee databases. Window of opportunity opens at 16:30 when the cleaning crews arrive. Jake acknowledged the report while studying the photographs that Charlie had taken during 3 weeks of surveillance. The images showed guard rotations, camera positions, and the faces of people who worked for Hartwell in various capacities. Every detail had been cataloged with the precision of children who understood that overlooking anything could result in capture by people who had no interest in treating them with mercy appropriate to their age. "Weather update," Sam's voice cut through the static from his position at the abandoned mining office where banks of computers monitored everything from building security systems to police radio frequencies. Storm front arriving 2 hours ahead of schedule. Wind speeds increasing, visibility decreasing. Local authorities are advising against unnecessary travel. The early arrival of the blizzard was both opportunity and threat, providing cover that would hide their movements while creating conditions that could strand them in Helena if their escape routes became impassable. Jake checked his watch and calculated timing that would need to be precise to the minute if they wanted to complete their mission and return to Pine Ridge Valley before the storm made travel impossible. "Danny, Benny, status report," Jake transmitted to the twins who were positioned inside the Pinnacle building, disguised as part of a school group that was touring local businesses as part of a career exploration program. Their youthful appearance and natural ability to blend into crowds made them ideal for reconnaissance that would be impossible for adults to accomplish. Hartwell left his office at 15:45 for a meeting with the mayor's office. Danny's voice came back immediately. His personal assistant confirmed that he won't return today due to weather conditions. Office security has been reduced to minimum staffing in preparation for early closure. Building maintenance confirms that heating system modifications will require temporary power interruptions to the 7th floor starting at 1700 hours, Benny added. Estimated duration 30 minutes, during which emergency lighting will be the only illumination in target areas. Jake smiled despite the tension that was making his hands shake. The power interruption was not a coincidence. It was the result of Max's 3-week infiltration of the building's computer systems, a cyber warfare operation conducted by an 11-year-old who understood network security better than most professionals. The children had turned the building's own infrastructure into a weapon against the man who thought his fortress was impregnable. Max, Bobby, confirm infiltration route. Jake transmitted to the 2 boys who were positioned in the building's sub-basement, where utility tunnels connected to the ventilation system that would carry them to their target, without passing through monitored corridors. Ventilation access secured, path verified clear to 7th floor. Max responded with the calm professionalism of someone reporting routine maintenance rather than the beginning of a burglary that could result in federal charges. Charlie is in position at the emergency exit that will provide egress once the mission is complete. All electronic countermeasures active, Bobby added. Security cameras in target area will display loop footage during the operational window. Motion sensors have been disabled through system maintenance protocols. We're invisible to everything except human observation. The sophistication of their preparation impressed Jake more each time he heard the details. These children had spent weeks studying their target with the intensity of military planners, identifying vulnerabilities and creating solutions that exploited weaknesses in systems designed by adults who had never considered that their greatest threat might come from people small enough to crawl through spaces that weren't supposed to accommodate human beings. Jake, you're cleared for approach. Tommy's voice cut through his admiration for the children's competence. Target building is secure. Weather conditions are optimal for concealment. All team members are in position and ready to proceed on your signal. Jake climbed out of his truck and walked toward the pinnacle building, with the measured pace of someone conducting routine business rather than approaching the most dangerous moment of his life. The wind whipped snow across the sidewalk in patterns that reduced visibility and muffled sound, creating exactly the conditions that would allow him to enter the building without attracting attention from security personnel who were more concerned with staying warm than with identifying potential threats. The lobby of the pinnacle building was nearly empty, its marble floors reflecting fluorescent lights that cast everything in the sterile glow of institutional efficiency. 2 security guards sat behind a desk that commanded views of all entrances, but their attention was focused on television weather reports that promised the kind of storm that would keep them working late into the night. Jake approached the desk with documents that identified him as an insurance adjuster investigating weather damage claims, a cover story that explained his presence while requiring no verification that the guards were equipped to provide. Rough night to be working, Jake commented as he signed the visitor log with handwriting that belonged to someone who didn't exist. Tell me about it, the older guard replied without looking up from his television screen. Management says we can't leave until the storm passes, which could be tomorrow morning at this rate. Jake nodded sympathetically while palming the key card that Charlie had lifted from a cleaning supervisor 3 hours earlier. Technology that would provide access to areas where visitors weren't supposed to go. The theft had been accomplished with pickpocket skills that belonged in circus performances rather than in the hands of a 7-year-old who should have been learning arithmetic instead of planning felonies. Stay safe, Jake said as he walked toward the elevators, his voice carrying genuine concern for people who had no idea they were about to become unwilling participants in an operation that would expose their employer as a criminal. The elevator rose through floors occupied by legitimate businesses that had no connection to Hartwell's systematic destruction of families across Pine Ridge Valley. Jake watched the numbers climb while listening to radio chatter that confirmed the children were moving through ventilation systems toward a rendezvous point that would put them in position to begin the most dangerous phase of their mission. 7th floor access achieved. Max's voice crackled through the static that was increasing as the storm intensified. Target office located. Security measures confirmed disabled. Beginning file extraction now. Jake exited the elevator into corridors that were dimly lit by emergency lighting, the result of Max's manipulation of building systems, creating exactly the conditions they needed to operate without detection. The power interruption had been timed to coincide with shift changes and early closures that would minimize the number of witnesses who might notice unusual activity on floors that were supposed to be empty. Jake, proceed to stairwell B7, Tommy directed from his observation post that provided oversight of the entire operation. Bobby and Charlie are moving into position to provide security while Max and Sam handle data extraction. Jake followed the directions through corridors that felt like the interior of a sleeping giant, aware that somewhere in the darkness, children were conducting an operation that would either save his ranch or destroy all their lives. The trust they had placed in him was almost unbearable, but so was the trust he had placed in them to accomplish something that adult investigators had failed to achieve in years of trying. Contact. Charlie's voice cut through the radio chatter with urgent intensity. Security guard conducting unscheduled patrol, approaching target area from the north corridor. Estimate 2 minutes until visual contact with insertion point. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he calculated distances and timing. That would determine whether the children could complete their mission before being discovered by someone who would ask questions they couldn't answer. The guard's presence wasn't part of normal protocols, which meant either their intelligence had been incomplete or someone had noticed anomalies that were attracting unwanted attention. Bobby, can you create a distraction? Tommy's voice carried the calm authority of someone managing a crisis that could spiral out of control within seconds. Negative, too close to target area, Bobby replied. Any distraction would draw attention toward our location rather than away from it. Max, how much time do you need? Jake transmitted while moving toward a position where he could intervene if the children's escape routes were compromised. 3 minutes minimum to extract financial records, 5 minutes to access the complete database. Max responded without stopping his work. Currently downloading corporate communications that document fraud patterns going back 6 years. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. The security guard would reach the children's position before they could complete their mission and escape through ventilation routes that had brought them to the 7th floor undetected. Someone would have to delay the guard without arousing suspicions that would bring additional security personnel to investigate areas where children were conducting industrial espionage against one of Montana's most powerful men. I'm going to buy you time, Jake transmitted as he walked toward the corridor where the guard was approaching. Continue the mission until I tell you to abort. Jake, negative, Tommy's voice carried urgent concern. If you're caught in that area, it compromises everything we've worked for. If Max is caught extracting those files, it compromises everyone we're trying to protect. Jake replied, understanding that leadership sometimes meant accepting risks that others couldn't be asked to take. Jake rounded the corner and encountered the security guard exactly where Charlie's intelligence had predicted. A middle-aged man whose flashlight beam swept across walls and doorways with the bored efficiency of someone conducting routine checks that rarely revealed anything interesting. The guard's expression shifted to mild curiosity when he saw Jake, but nothing in his posture suggested alarm or suspicion. Insurance adjuster, Jake said, before the guard could ask questions, displaying credentials that would pass casual inspection, checking for weather damage on the upper floors. Hell of a storm out there. You're telling me, the guard replied, relaxing as Jake's explanation fit perfectly with the building's current concerns about roof integrity and window seals that might not withstand wind speeds that were approaching hurricane levels. Find anything interesting? Nothing major so far, Jake said, leading the guard away from the area where Max was extracting evidence that could expose Hartwell's criminal empire. Though I'd like to get another look at those windows on the east side. The wind stress might be causing structural issues that won't show up until spring. The guard followed Jake toward windows that faced the storm, their conversation covering building maintenance issues while children crawled through ventilation systems 30 feet away with hard drives containing evidence that could save Pine Ridge Valley from systematic destruction. The timing was perfect in the way that only came from luck and preparation meeting at exactly the right moment. The courthouse steps in Helena were slick with ice that reflected camera flashes like scattered diamonds, each burst of light illuminating faces that belonged to people who had never expected to stand together in solidarity against forces that had seemed insurmountable just 6 months earlier. Jake Mitchell adjusted his tie with hands that were steady for the first time in years, watching as journalists positioned themselves to capture testimony that would reshape how Montana dealt with corporate land acquisition and the systematic destruction of rural communities. Sarah Parker stood to his left, her silver hair catching the winter sunlight as she spoke with reporters about the night 15 years ago, when mysterious fires had consumed her prize-breeding stock and convinced her that fighting Victor Hartwell was impossible. Tom Henderson occupied the space to Jake's right, his weathered rancher's hands holding documents that proved his family's land had been stolen through fabricated environmental violations that had never existed until Hartwell needed justification for forced acquisition. Behind them, 37 families filled the courthouse steps with the quiet dignity of people who had survived systematic persecution and emerged stronger for the experience. They represented every property that Hartwell had acquired through fraud, intimidation, and violence, but they also represented something more important, proof that predators were only successful until their prey learned to hunt in packs. The 7 children who had made this moment possible stood in a cluster near the courthouse doors, their faces reflecting satisfaction that came from knowing they had transformed themselves from victims into instruments of justice. Tommy held a tablet computer containing financial records that documented 6 years of criminal activity, while Max carried hard drives filled with communications that would ensure Hartwell faced federal charges that no amount of money or influence could eliminate. Sam and Bobby flanked Charlie, whose small hands clutched photographs that showed security camera footage of Hartwell's men committing acts of vandalism and arson that had been blamed on accidents or natural disasters. Danny and Benny stood slightly apart from their companions, their matching expressions reflecting the profound satisfaction of children who had learned that mathematics could be a weapon when applied to exposing patterns of theft that corrupt officials had overlooked for years. Their analysis of Hartwell's financial records had revealed the scope of his operation with precision that would make forensic accountants weep with appreciation. "Ladies and gentlemen," District Attorney Margaret Chun stepped up to the microphone that had been positioned to address the crowd of reporters and supporters who had gathered despite weather conditions that made travel treacherous. Today marks the culmination of the most extensive investigation into corporate fraud in Montana's history. Jake listened to the prosecutor's opening remarks while remembering the moment 6 months earlier, when he had been digging what he thought would be his own grave behind a barn that now served as headquarters for an agricultural cooperative that included 15 families who had reclaimed their stolen land through legal action backed by irrefutable evidence. The transformation from despair to hope had happened so gradually that he sometimes struggled to believe it was real. The evidence gathered by concerned citizens working in cooperation with law enforcement has revealed a pattern of criminal activity that spans multiple counties and involves dozens of shell corporations designed to hide systematic theft from families who had committed no crime other than owning land that Victor Hartwell wanted to acquire for development purposes. The children exchanged glances that spoke of shared memories involving midnight infiltrations, computer hacking that would have impressed government intelligence agencies, and the kind of courage that came from people who had already lost everything once and refused to accept that fate again. Their transformation from homeless refugees to tactical specialists had been driven by necessity, but it had produced skills that were now being celebrated by law enforcement officials who had initially dismissed their claims as impossible fantasies. Mr. Hartwell has been charged with 37 counts of fraud, 18 counts of conspiracy, 12 counts of money laundering, and numerous related charges that carry potential sentences totaling over 200 years in federal prison. His associates face similar charges that reflect their participation in an enterprise that destroyed families and communities for the sake of profit margins that have been deemed obscene by financial experts. Margaret Chen paused to allow photographers to capture images that would appear on front pages across the northwestern United States. Visual evidence that corporate criminals could be held accountable when their victims refused to surrender to intimidation and chose instead to organize resistance that employed methods their oppressors had never anticipated. The investigation was initiated by Jake Mitchell, whose Mitchell Ranch became the focal point for a community organization that included some of the most innovative investigative techniques this office has ever encountered. Mr. Mitchell and his associates demonstrated that ordinary citizens possess capabilities that can exceed those of trained professionals when they are motivated by justice rather than profit. Jake stepped forward to address the assembled crowd, feeling the weight of responsibility that came from representing not just his own interests, but those of everyone who had been victimized by people who viewed human suffering as acceptable. Business overhead. The microphone amplified his voice across courthouse steps that had been slick with ice an hour earlier, but were now warming under sunlight that seemed to promise better times ahead. 6 months ago, I was ready to give up, Jake began, his voice carrying across the crowd with steady confidence that would have been impossible during his darkest moments. Victor Hartwell had convinced me that resistance was futile, that powerful people always win, and that the best I could hope for was surrender with minimal dignity. He looked back at the 7 children who had taught him that surrender was just another word for accepting defeat before the battle had actually been lost. Their presence on the courthouse steps represented more than just successful completion of a dangerous mission. It represented the transformation of desperation into determination, fear into courage, and isolation into community that transcended traditional definitions of family. What I learned is that predators depend on their victims remaining isolated and hopeless. They invest enormous resources in convincing people that resistance is impossible, that justice is reserved for those who can afford it, and that ordinary families have no power against corporate entities with unlimited budgets and political connections. The crowd murmured agreement as Jake's words resonated with experiences that had been shared by rural communities across the American West, places where corporate consolidation had destroyed ways of life that had sustained families for generations. His testimony was personal, but it was also universal in ways that made his individual story representative of struggles being fought in every state, where land had value that exceeded the worth of the people who had lived on it for decades. But what Victor Hartwell and people like him never anticipated is that some of their victims would refuse to accept defeat. They never imagined that children who had been failed by every system designed to protect them would develop skills that could expose criminal enterprises that had operated with impunity for years. Jake gestured toward the 7 young people who had transformed themselves from refugees into revolutionaries, their faces reflecting pride that came from knowing they had accomplished something that would be remembered long after the legal proceedings had concluded and the news crews had moved on to other stories. These 7 individuals taught me that home is not just a place where you happen to live, but a place where you choose to make a stand for values that matter more than money. They showed me that family is not just about blood relationships, but about people who refuse to abandon each other when facing impossible odds. Tommy stepped forward and took the microphone, his young voice carrying authority that belonged to someone who had learned leadership through necessity rather than training. The crowd fell silent as they prepared to hear testimony from the mastermind behind an operation that had brought down one of Montana's most powerful men using nothing but intelligence, courage, and the kind of tactical thinking that came from months of surviving against overwhelming disadvantages. Adults always told us that children should be seen, not heard, that we should trust the systems designed to take care of us, and that our job was to be grateful for whatever protection society chose to provide, Tommy said, his words cutting through the winter air with precision that made experienced prosecutors take notes. But those same adults created systems that failed us repeatedly, that separated us from each other, and that treated us like problems to be managed rather than people with rights that deserved protection. The reporters scribbled frantically as Tommy continued his testimony, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of juvenile activism. His speech was not the result of coaching by adult advisors, but rather the authentic voice of someone who had experienced systematic failure and chosen to do something about it rather than accepting it as inevitable. We learned to take care of ourselves because nobody else would do it. We learned to trust each other because trusting adults had taught us that betrayal was the normal outcome of vulnerability. And we learned to fight back because running away had never led to anywhere safe. Tommy looked directly at the cameras that would broadcast his words across networks that reached every corner of the country, his expression reflecting determination that had been forged in wilderness conditions that would have broken most adults. His testimony was being heard by children in similar situations, young people who had been convinced that they were powerless against forces beyond their control. What we discovered is that the same people who told us we were helpless had made themselves vulnerable by underestimating what we could accomplish when we stopped believing their lies about our limitations. They built security systems that were designed to stop adults, but they never considered that their greatest threat might come from people who were small enough to crawl through ventilation systems. The crowd erupted in applause that echoed off the courthouse walls like thunder, recognition of courage that had been displayed by people who were barely old enough to drive cars, but had successfully conducted operations that would have challenged trained intelligence professionals. Tommy waited for the noise to subside before delivering the conclusion that would define how this story would be remembered. We're not asking for sympathy or special treatment because of our age. We're demanding recognition that children have the same rights as adults to protect themselves from people who want to harm them, and that includes the right to use whatever methods are necessary to expose criminals who hide behind respectability and corporate structures. Jake reclaimed the microphone as Tommy stepped back into the group of children who had become his family through shared struggle rather than biological accident. The moment felt like a conclusion, but it was actually a beginning that would reshape how these 8 people thought about their future and their responsibilities to communities that had supported them during their darkest hours. The legal proceedings against Victor Hartwell and his associates will continue for months, possibly years, Jake announced to the assembled crowd. But the real victory has already been achieved. 37 families have reclaimed their stolen land. A criminal enterprise has been exposed and dismantled. And a community has learned that ordinary people possess extraordinary power when they choose to use it. The courthouse steps began to empty as reporters rushed to file stories that would dominate news cycles for weeks to come. But Jake and the 7 children remained in place, watching the sun break through clouds that had been threatening snow all morning. The weather was clearing, both literally and metaphorically, revealing possibilities that had been hidden by storms that no longer seemed as threatening as they once had. What happens now? Charlie asked, his young voice carrying curiosity about a future that no longer felt predetermined by forces beyond their control. Jake looked out across Helena toward mountains that sheltered Pine Ridge Valley, where Mitchell Ranch was being transformed into something larger than a single family's agricultural operation. The land would support multiple families who had chosen to work together rather than face uncertain futures in isolation, creating an economic model that prioritized community sustainability over individual profit maximization. "Now we go home," Jake said, understanding that home was no longer just a place but a concept that included people who had chosen to belong to each other regardless of their biological relationships or legal status. And we figure out how to turn everything we've learned into something that helps other people who are facing the same kinds of problems we solved. The drive back to Pine Ridge Valley took 3 hours through mountain passes that were still treacherous from recent storms. But the truck was warm and filled with conversation about plans that extended far beyond saving a single ranch from corporate acquisition. The children discussed educational opportunities that would allow them to develop their unusual skills into conventional careers while maintaining the bonds that had sustained them through their most difficult challenges. Max talked about computer science programs that would formalize his instinctive understanding of network security into qualifications that could lead to careers protecting other people from cyber threats. Sam and Bobby described agricultural engineering projects that could help small ranchers compete against corporate farming operations that had advantages of scale but lacked innovation that came from desperate necessity. Tommy outlined plans for law school that would prepare him to represent families facing the same kinds of systematic persecution that had nearly destroyed Jake's ranch and countless others. Danny and Benny explained mathematical models they were developing to detect fraud patterns in real estate transactions, tools that could prevent future victims from suffering the losses that had motivated their own transformation from refugees into resistance fighters. Charlie, the youngest but perhaps the most philosophical of the group, talked about writing books that would tell stories of children who had refused to accept the limitations that adults had tried to impose on their potential. His narratives would inspire other young people to recognize that age was not a barrier to effectiveness when effectiveness was driven by intelligence, courage, and commitment to protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The ranch came into view as the sun was setting behind mountains that no longer seemed like barriers, but rather boundaries that defined a space where people could build something better than what they had left behind. The house glowed with warm light that promised hot meals and comfortable beds, but more importantly, it promised belonging that was not conditional on anything other than willingness to contribute to something larger than individual survival. Jake parked the truck near the barn where he had once dug a hole that was supposed to contain his buried dreams, but which now served as the foundation for a greenhouse that would provide fresh vegetables throughout the winter months. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Places that had once represented endings could be transformed into beginnings when people chose hope over despair and action over resignation. "Family meeting in 10 minutes, Tommy announced as they unloaded equipment from their trip to Helena, maintaining the organizational discipline that had made their operation successful. "We need to review what happened today and plan our next steps." Jake smiled as he watched the children organize themselves with efficiency that would have impressed military commanders, understanding that their success had come not from luck or special talents, but from their willingness to take responsibility for outcomes that adults had told them were beyond their control. They had learned to function as a team because individual survival had been impossible, and now that teamwork was being applied to challenges that could benefit entire communities. The kitchen table was once again covered with maps and documents, but these papers represented opportunities rather than threats. Development plans showed how reclaimed ranch properties could be connected through cooperative agreements that would allow families to share resources and expertise while maintaining individual ownership and decision-making authority. Financial projections demonstrated that sustainable agriculture could be more profitable than corporate farming when communities worked together to eliminate redundancy and maximize efficiency. The state attorney general wants to establish a task force to investigate similar fraud patterns in other counties, Sam reported, consulting notes he had taken during conversations with prosecutors who had been impressed by the evidence the children had gathered. "They're asking if we would be willing to consult on cases where traditional investigation methods have been unsuccessful." The Department of Agriculture is interested in our cooperative model as a pilot program for rural economic development, Bobby added, showing documents that describe federal funding opportunities for communities that could demonstrate sustainable alternatives to corporate consolidation. We could receive grants that would help other families establish similar operations. Jake listened to their reports while preparing dinner for 8 people who had become more than just residents of the same house, understanding that their individual rescue had evolved into something with potential to rescue entire regions from economic forces that had been destroying rural communities for decades. The children had taught him that solutions often came from unexpected sources when conventional approaches had failed to address root causes of systemic problems. Montana State University wants to establish a research partnership to study our agricultural techniques and security innovations, Max announced, displaying correspondence from academics who had learned about their operation through media coverage of the Hartwell investigation. They're offering scholarships for anyone interested in pursuing formal education that builds on what we've already learned through practical experience. The offers represented validation that their unconventional methods had produced results that impressed professionals who had spent years studying problems without finding solutions. But more importantly, the recognition meant that their story would inspire other people to attempt similar innovations instead of accepting defeat when facing overwhelming odds. "What do you think?" Jake asked, looking around the table at faces that reflected intelligence and determination that had been forged through adversity, but was now being channeled toward constructive purposes. "Are we ready to take on challenges that extend beyond saving our own home?" The agreement was unanimous and immediate, reflecting understanding that their obligation extended beyond personal security to include protection of communities that were facing similar threats from people who viewed human suffering as acceptable business costs. They had learned to defend themselves. Now they would learn to defend others who lacked the resources or knowledge to mount effective resistance. "Then we keep fighting," Tommy said, speaking for the group with authority that had been earned through successful completion of an impossible mission, not because we have to anymore, but because we can. The decision marked the transformation of their family from a group of survivors into a force for change that would reshape how rural communities dealt with corporate predators and systematic economic persecution. Their ranch would become a model for sustainable agriculture. Their children would become advocates for others who faced similar challenges, and their story would become inspiration for people who had been convinced that resistance was futile. As night fell over Pine Ridge Valley, 8 people who had found each other at the moment when surrender seemed inevitable gathered around a kitchen table to plan campaigns that would protect families they had never met from threats they understood better than anyone. They had learned that home was worth fighting for, that family was worth creating, and that justice was worth pursuing regardless of the odds against success. The war against people who destroyed communities for profit would continue, but now it would be fought by people who understood that the most effective weapons were intelligence, courage, and refusal to accept that powerful predators were invincible. Victor Hartwell had made the mistake of targeting people who were stronger than they appeared, and that mistake had cost him everything. Other corporate criminals would learn the same lesson, or they would face the same consequences. Outside, snow began to fall again, but this time it brought promises of spring rather than threats of winter. The storm had passed, the home had been saved, and the family had discovered that they were capable of far more than they had ever imagined. When they first found each other in the darkness behind a barn where a man had been digging his own grave, until 7 mysterious children appeared from the forest to teach him that some stories end with new beginnings rather than final defeats. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.